Hi, I'm Faith, and I'm going to be talking about the contributions to the African diaspora studies. And since our article is about education, then I'm going to have to kind of talk about the whole thing. So first, in the foreword, Gordon talks about what Africa is seen as, and then a passage from page 1 of the foreword says to think of the African diaspora as a racial fact. And then down below it says Africa, as the opposite to Europe, is understood to be inhabited by inferior, savage, non-Christian, uncivilized beings who are black with woolly hair and large noses. And it basically just talks about how Africans were transported by Europeans to the Americas to be racialized, modernized, and civilized. So I think that's a good way to talk about how this whole article came to be and what it's talking about, because it's good to deconstruct that whole notion that black people are complete savages or just the complete opposite of white people in terms of them being good and holy and pure and black people being the complete opposite of them. I think that African diaspora studies helps to deconstruct that entire notion. I know for me, when I was in school, Africa wasn't explicitly seen as that kind of place, but when we were learning about colonialism, it was like saying that Europeans were in search of better resources, which was, disguising the fact of what they really thought about us. So I thought that was interesting. So I'm going to talk about some common topics. The first one is going to be the contribution to the curriculum. It recognizes that populations of color are commonly left out. I know that many of my teachers had to teach outside of the curriculum. So I grew up in the Metro Atlanta area, and we had, and I'm pretty sure other states had this too, but we had something called Common Core. And I could just tell that that the teachers were teaching to the test. But every once in a while, I would get teachers that really, really cared and would go outside of the curriculum. So for example, I had a teacher that kind of did something similar to what Jane Elliott did with the blue-eye, brown-eye experiment, teaching about discrimination. But instead, in my case, it was earrings or no earrings. But that's a conversation for a different day if anybody wants to talk about it. Secondly, they talked about topics that they talked about in their week-long summer institute. So those included transatlantic slave trade and slavery, social movements, resistance and activism, Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism, and land displacement and migration. So I think those were just really nice topics that they talked about, because oftentimes we'll just talk about Black history like civil rights and the Voting Rights Act, which is wonderful to learn about, but we don't really learn about all the different parts of Black studies and ethnic studies. And they also talk about just teaching more about Black studies, like I said, rather than just US Black history. So understanding that there's Black populations in Latin America and South America, etc. My second topic is solutions for the lack of knowledge. So one of the authors, his first name was Kia, she basically realized that the knowledge was not trickling down. So she noticed the gap between an entire department dedicated to Black studies at colleges and universities that was not being translated into middle and high school classrooms. So what they were teaching about in college, is obviously different, but that same knowledge, middle and high schoolers didn't know about it at all. So they wanted to bridge that gap. Then they were talking about how there exists a need to teach more about the origins of slavery. And then one of the creators of the ADFP stated that many of her students were unaware of African descended communities in Latin America and were also not aware of the history of slavery. I was one of those people. I remember watching baseball, and that was the first time I saw an Afro-Latin person. I was like, oh my gosh, there's Black people in Latin America. I had no idea. One thing that I noted, this is just from my opinion, was that I wish that African diaspora as a whole would talk more about pre-colonial Africa. We know that there was history that existed before chattel slavery, but I personally have never seen the proof. But nonetheless, I'm glad that this book recognizes that such a history does exist prior to chattel slavery. but it admits that that's not necessarily their focus for this book. My third topic is inserting notions about going beyond. So also another passage in the foreword says, the diaspora has been a way to sustain a conversation about Black people beyond the boundaries of nations and their respective histories while creating connections between them. So once again, just noticing that Black populations are outside of the U.S. and noticing that it's an integral part of the African diaspora to recognize that it's not just about the U.S. or it's not just about a respective country that somebody comes from. The African diaspora looks at the dispersal of people through the slave trade, and then again, like wherever else they dispersed after that. So it's transnational, it's across oceans, it's across boundaries. So I thought that was really important to highlight. Also, just like another little point was saying that I had to find out about the African diaspora through like television. Like, I didn't know that Brazil had such a large Black population. I remember I was probably in middle school when I figured it out, but it was like through a documentary. It wasn't in school. So I would have really appreciated if that kind of stuff was noted. But I understand that that's what this article is about, and that's what they're trying to get into the school system. So not only about going beyond national boundaries, but also boundaries for who this information would be useful for. So they first intended it for it to be social studies and world language teachers, but they expanded it to English language arts teachers as well. So making it disciplinary or interdisciplinary was very important in the notion of like going beyond what we usually think about in Black studies or African diaspora studies. And then my last topic is the overall contribution to African diaspora studies. So I know that that's what we've really been talking about, but this is what I pulled as like the most important topics from that section. So basically like informing us of what it is. And this quote says, African diaspora can be distinguished from the study of African Americans in the United States. And then in the last few paragraphs of the foreword, we find out the purpose for this. They want to engage the historical threads of diaspora to touch on and ask essential questions about what and how we teach the history of African descended peoples. And then at the start of the introduction, we see another example of the purpose for this as it pertains to the creation of the ADFP, which is to provide professional development about African, African American, and Afro-Latin American studies to teachers in North Carolina. And then it specifically says that their intent was to advance educators' knowledge of and familiarity with African diaspora communities, and as a way to provide resources for teaching about topics and people that are often invisible or overlooked in traditional school curricula. So then my last 2 points, which I feel like are the most important, is that we should think of the classroom as a site of diaspora. Especially like for the youth, it's really important that we notice that this is a space where Black people exist. And, we get a chance to see how Black students are interacting with the curriculum in the school system. And it's kind of like our job to notice what's going on. Like, I'm sure as students, we all notice that we learned a whole lot in ADW that we didn't learn in middle and high school. So then lastly, it says, this book is intended to be a resource for teachers, program administrators, youth leaders, curriculum developers, and anyone interested in increasing the visibility of African descended communities and histories in what students learn. So it's just saying that it's a way to enrich education, provide greater points of access for Black people and students of color. And then they also wanted it to be like a way to lift up the agency of Black individuals to shape action, culture, resistance movements, and community building. So I thought that was really, really important. But that's it. So thank you.